Okay, this video is George Washington the true father of the United States of America? Okay, this painting right here shows the first battle of the Revolutionary War, which began in 1775. There were skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. And the famous poem by Longfellow relates to Paul Revere's ride. You know, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Okay, so I remember memorizing that poem for high school. And then another one we had to memorize in high school right here, Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Shot Heard Round the World. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once in battle farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. So yes, it was a very big deal that it had turned to an open battle. And this made the Americans aware that they were not going to be able to have a peaceful resolution to their conflict with England. England had progressively, under the rulership of King George, taken more and more freedom away from the Americans. And they were pissed off. And men back in those days had high testosterone. They're not like the feminized, estrogenic, overloaded men of today. They were not going to accept being treated so unfairly. They did not want to be enslaved. So then, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is in Charleston Peninsula in Boston, this was in 1775. The Americans held a position on Bunker Hill, and the British came to charge the hill. Basically, back in those days, the British had big bayonets on their rifles, and what would happen is there was a musket ball that they could only fire one shot at a time, the soldiers' rifles. So they would just charge the hill and be willing to accept one shot. The muskets weren't as accurate as rifles are nowadays. But they also thought the Americans were a bunch of cowards and disorganized rebels, you know, drunks, alcoholics, and all this stuff. But they were amazed at how well the Americans fought. And the Americans killed tons and tons of British soldiers at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The only reason the Americans retreated was because they had run out of ammunition. The British had far more soldiers. Their soldiers were far more experienced, far better trained, better equipped, you name it. But the Americans were very brave, and they were fighting for their lives, fighting for their country. So this was described as a Pyrrhic victory, whereby even though the Brits, at the end of the day, captured Bunker Hill, they did so at tremendous casualties. And General Howe, who was the future leader of the entire British Army, learned a lot from this. He learned to have respect for the Americans, and it actually made him kind of scared of the Americans, which worked to the Americans' advantage later on, because the Brits were amazed at how well the Americans fought. Okay, then this is a continuation of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Once the British could get past the line of American soldiers, they would then use their bayonets to kill a lot of the Americans. The Americans often were just fighting with a rifle with no bayonet on it. And here's General Mercer. He was actually one of the great founding fathers of the United States of America. He was especially based in Boston. And, you know, they would just bayonet and kill the Americans that they could catch beyond the original line of fire. So the Americans were quite pissed off by the British going around with their standing army and abusing the American citizens. There was the Boston massacre and whatnot. And so this was the spirit of 1776. The Americans were pissed off. They wanted their freedom. And a decision had been made to make a declaration of independence. And one of the rousing speeches was by Patrick Henry at the Virginia Convention in 1775. So here's Patrick Henry's speech. "Guard with jealousy the public liberty. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are inevitably ruined. It is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and to listen to the song of that siren until she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not? The things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way of judging the future but by the past. For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it might cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. If life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery, forbid it Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry, Virginia Convention, 1775. Okay, now they called in Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant guy and a great writer. And they asked him to write the Declaration of Independence because they knew he was a great writer, and also because he was from Virginia. Virginia was the most populous colony of that time, and they also felt that would help to unify all the colonies versus the Northeasterners, often sort of had big mouths, but they weren't as well liked by the Southerners. So Jefferson was the man to write the Declaration of Independence. Ben Franklin was a genius to help edit it as well. And so here's a line from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's Declaration of Independence in 1776. Key point here is the rights are endowed by a Creator. If you are created in the image of God, you're entitled to rights by being partly divine. And if you're not, in the modern parlance, then you're just a talking monkey by atheistic Darwinism. Okay, of course, Ben Franklin was great with his scientific work, and he was, given honorary doctorates, all kinds of good stuff. So that's a topic for another day, but he was obviously a great, brilliant man. Here's a quote from Ben Franklin. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty. Without freedom of speech, when the truth and error have fair play, their former is always at an overmatch for the latter. So just, be aware of it. That's all Ben Franklin there is. The public has to have free speech in order to figure out what the truth is about different types of situations. And anyone who tries to deny them free speech is a tyrant. Okay, so if you ever hear somebody saying, oh, that's hate speech or whatever, that's bullshit, okay? People need to be able to speak the truth. And sometimes people will say things that are wrong or inappropriate, but you need to work through all that as part of a conversation, okay? So just be aware of that. You can really quickly tell who is not out for your best interest when they're telling you can't have free speech. And usually it'll be disguised. They'll call it preventing misinformation. Yeah, this basically whatever they say is correct information, and that'll be pushed by force. Okay, so here's the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the other thing, too, is you hear all this stuff. The guys who founded America were a bunch of white Christian heterosexual men. Okay, that's who founded America. Now, in the current parlance, they are all being scapegoated. Okay, my mother's from Puerto Rico. Okay, she couldn't wait to come to the United States because there were more opportunities. And yeah, life was pretty brutal in a lot of places in the old days. Okay, my other family, my father was from Ireland, and the British enslaved the Irish. Okay, and it was pretty bad. I even have a slave name. Rogers is like my slave name. My real Irish name is McCarty, son of a red-haired king. Rogers comes from rouge, like to put red makeup on your face. The red ones. The British basically said to my ancestor family, "You're not the sons of the king. You are just the red ones." And that was our name from there on out, Rogers. Okay, so I tell you all that because the sad truth is that when you read about the history of the world, the normal way most cultures have been is slavery or serfdom or a caste system. So that is unfortunate. We've been very lucky in America to have the freedom we've had, and I'm telling you, it comes from these guys saying we want freedom, and they're going to fight for it as they did against the British, and then they're going to make a constitution to maintain it. Okay, and that's just what happened. So people say, oh, racism, discrimination is bad, but they practice it every day. Okay, and they shouldn't. Okay, and they were religious. You need to have religion in order to have the metaphysical concept that humans are created in the image of God and therefore deserve rights. If you don't have that, then basically the rights are simply whatever the ruler wants, and the ruler will simply be the one who has the most military power. Okay, so that's an important thing. Our American founding fathers founded this place based on freedom and religious freedom and created in the image of God, unlike the French Revolution, which was sort of an evil atheistic revolution. It's very different than the American Revolution. Okay, George Washington at the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie. That comes from a story written about him, retrospectively by Parson Weems, just sort of a famous story. A few words on George Washington. He lived from 1732 to 1799, and he really had a tough life. He had lost almost all of his teeth. He was kind of self-conscious about it. He hardly ever smiled because he had no teeth. His face was scarred from smallpox. That had happened to him when he took his brother who was dying of tuberculosis, down to these tropical islands to try to see if the warm weather would help him. And they think that the smallpox also made him sterile, so he could never have his own children. And that might be part of why he was so willing to devote his life to saving America. America was like his child, okay? The guy, he was a great man, and he had a tough life. He was a great horseman. He was the best horseman of his age. And yeah, they went fox hunting. Men did masculine things. They had high testosterone. Back in those days, they were very self-reliant. And he was a big, strong guy, about 6'2", 200 pounds. And he was a tough guy. And he was very noble and honorable. He loved his wife very much. Okay? And as I was saying, we didn't get into all this stuff about all the different cultures, but that's how it was in those days. George Washington saw America's desire to be free as being symbolic of freedom throughout the entire world. And he said, if liberty should expire in our country, it is likely to expire in the entire world. By the way, if you want to read a book about it, the best one I've encountered is this book by Dugard with Bill O'Reilly. I think that's the most entertaining one on the history of George Washington and the Revolutionary War. I read the 1776 book by McCullough, and it's good, but there's lots of social info. It almost reminds me of a book written by a woman. I read tons of books, and so a lot of times when I read a book by a woman, she goes into all this personal data and conversations and who's friends with who. And, don't get me wrong, that's good. I like to learn that stuff too. Whereas a guy tends to focus on chronology of events and the sequence of action. It just tends to be they write differently. Okay, DVD miniseries movie about George Washington starring Barry Bostwick was very good. The movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson about Francis Marion the Swamp Fox and the conflict with Banastre Tarleton, the sort of evil English officer, is quite interesting. And many times George Washington was at risk to lose the entire war. He barely won the war, and we were under perilous circumstances at many times. The British had lots more soldiers, better equipped, better armed, and especially early on, some really bad losses happened to the Americans. So here's another quote by George Washington. The time is now at hand which must determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and themselves consigned to a state of wretchedness. The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God, and on the courage and conduct of this army. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. July 1776, George Washington. And that is the spirit of 1776. And the other men of America at that time, they understood how great George Washington was. Here's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. George Washington has a mind that is great and powerful. No judgment was ever sounder. His integrity was most pure. He was indeed, in every sense of the words, a wise, a good, and a great man. Thomas Jefferson. George Washington didn't have to do it. He was wealthy. He had a nice farm. He could have just lived out his life on a nice farm. He didn't have to protect America from the British. Okay, so in the beginning, we talked about the initial skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Then the Brits had taken over Boston. And George Washington did a brilliant maneuver. In the middle of the night, he got all his men up on top of Dorchester Heights, Dorchester Hill. And from that position, they could fire their cannons at all the British positions, and the British were forced to flee Boston. So that was a great victory for the Americans. It was brilliant, all right? So the Americans got off to a great start. Okay, and this is a painting by Emanuel Lutz. But then the Americans really screwed up. The British now had their headquarters in New York, and George Washington foolishly went out to New York to follow the British there. But the problem with New York is you see all these rivers. They were the perfect setup for the British to rapidly be able to ship their men around in their boats and their cannons. So the Americans got their butts kicked in New York. Okay, it was really bad. And one example was the Battle of Fort Washington in 1776 when they were overrun by the Hessians. The Hessians were the German missionaries. And this is the one lady who was sort of named, and this painting is by Don Troiani. And he's a great military artist. And this was made for some special event to talk about women too. But her husband was manning the cannon and he got killed. And so she went up and helped with the cannon and she also was killed. once they would get over the fort's barricades, the British, they all had these long bayonets, and they would just bayonet the Americans. They killed a lot of Americans with their bayonets. It's quite brutal. And they were able to charge an armed fortress because the musket could only get off one shot. So they were willing to take that one shot, which wasn't always that accurate, for the opportunity to charge and then bayonet people. So that's how battle was in those days. And the Hessians, they were well experienced, good fighters. Okay, and this is an example where George Washington screwed up. He should have recognized that New York was, had rivers all over the place, and the Brits controlled the waterways, so it was a giant advantage to them. And he didn't realize that until he'd already lost, thousands of men. And here's just a picture sort of showing what happened to the Americans in New York. The Brits just controlled the waterway, so they could get their men to different locations very quickly. Their ships could fire cannons, from the waterway, and that really made it pretty much impossible for the Americans to do anything in New York, except finally they retreated, and luckily they were lucky to escape alive without being surrounded by the Brits. And so it was a disaster, the loss of the Americans in New York in 1776. But what, George W., he knew he had to do something to cheer up his forces, because lots of men were deserting, they weren't getting paid, they didn't have adequate equipment. So he made this stunning raid in the middle of the night. Look at all his men all the way out here, crossing the Delaware River to attack the Hessian soldiers at Trenton. And this was a great victory for the Americans. They caught the German mercenaries by surprise, and they crushed them. And this greatly raised respect for the American forces. And it was real important that they could win some battles, because they wanted to get the French on their side. And here's where George W. captured the Hessians. And these German soldiers, they were brutal. They would, bayonet the American soldiers in areas where there were trees. They would bayonet them and stick them to trees. They would behead them. They were awful and brutal, the German Hessian mercenary soldiers, okay? I wrote missionaries there, which is a big mistake, obviously. John Trumbull was the artist, and he actually traveled with Washington and illustrated events from the Revolutionary War. Okay, here then was the Battle of Princeton, which was just a couple days after the victory over the Hessians at Trenton. And so in the Battle of Princeton, this is General Mercer, and this is a typical thing that would happen. If, the Brits got a hold of you and were up in close combat, hand-to-hand fighting, they would just bayonet the crap out of you and kill you. And it was a pretty awful way to die, but that was a common way that the Americans died at the hands of the British. The British had a lot of soldiers, and they would just charge right into the muskets, get over the wall of the fortress, and then bayonet the crap out of the Americans. And they killed lots and lots of America that way. But at this time, the Americans won both in Trenton and at Princeton. There's GW on his horse. And this was a big deal because Benjamin Franklin had traveled to France to try to get the French to support the Americans. And the French were like, you guys are a bunch of screw-ups. You're going to lose. Why should we support you? So these two big victories at Trenton and at Princeton gave the French confidence that America was worth supporting. And it also greatly boosted the morale of the American soldiers. Now here's a great painting by Arnold Freiberg of George Washington praying at Valley Forge. And you bet he prayed. He was really worried. And, he could have chickened out, and he didn't. He was in the middle of the fray. He was almost killed multiple times. He had several horses shot out from underneath him. He really took a lot more risks than a general officer should. Okay, he was a religious guy. He read the Bible a lot and prayed. And winter at Valley Forge was really difficult. Lots of American soldiers died from starvation. Many of them froze to death. At that time, he lost 2,000 soldiers from these bad conditions, not from combat, just from these bad conditions, and that was 1/6 of his entire army. Okay, so Valley Forge was difficult times. This soldier from France came, Lafayette, and he was a great friend and helper to George Washington. And here they are at Valley Forge, and again, you see the men, most of them, they don't even have a uniform. Their clothes are all torn up in rags. A lot of them weren't even in a tent. They're freezing. It was awful. So that's what I mean. You got to be a tough guy. This is not something, back in those days too, there was no birth control. The women were with their babies at home, okay? There's sort of this modern gaslighting nonsense trying to pretend men and women are the same. No, women had no birth control. They'd often have, 10 or more babies over the course of their life. There was a high infant mortality, so a lot of them, didn't survive, a lot of the children, sadly, but that's a big job. A woman's got shoulders and physical strength about like a prepubertal boy, okay? Which is like what, about 6th or 7th grade. And once a woman has a baby, that's the priority of her life, more so than her husband. Any guy will tell you that. And that's a big, great responsibility. Life on earth is dependent of humankind on that, okay? But the point I'm making is, it is the men who fought the battle, okay? It was these Christian heterosexual men, the group that is now scapegoated and demonized in the United States. They're the ones that made freedom in the United States possible by this victory over the British. And as far as homosexuals, I'll just tell you about this one guy. This is Baron von Steuben. He was also from Germany, as the Hessians were, a different part of Germany though. And he had gotten in trouble in Germany for his homosexual behavior. But George Washington recognized he was a guy with a lot of military experience that the Americans lacked. So he was invited to come to Valley Forge, and he was actually quite good at training the American soldiers. Actually, George Washington was very happy with his performance training the soldiers and gave him all kinds of promotions and benefits for that. And he also was trying to prove his career was over unless he could show that he had some worthwhile knowledge. And he did. He did a great job of helping to train the soldiers at Revolutionary War. But out of all the stuff I've read, that's the only single homosexual person I've heard of. Nowadays, there's like this gaslighting thing in, American Western society to try to pretend that almost everyone is a homosexual or thinking about it or something. No, it was a rare thing. And then there's also this gaslighting thing to pretend that women are as strong as men. No, that's ridiculous, okay? Everybody knows that from their personal experience. Okay, now here's a little bit about the reality of the British. The British basically felt they were superior to everybody. They considered the American rebels as just low-life pieces of crap, and they felt they didn't even need to follow, protocol, if you will, in war. This guy, Banastra Tarleton, was famous for being an evil officer for the British, and it was called Tarleton's Quarters, that when the Americans would surrender, he would just shoot all the prisoners. He would let the British men rape the American women, and the American had a counter to him, and he was Francis Marion, who became known as the Swamp Fox. And the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson is about him. And the Swamp Fox motto was liberty or death. And he fought kind of a Fabian-style harassment of the Brits, destroying their supply lines and whatnot, trying to discourage them. And so just remember that how evil Banastra Tarleton was. After he went back to England, they didn't care what he had done to the Americans. They considered the Americans lowlifes. And so he became a member of Parliament despite his well-known, well-documented atrocities against the Americans. Here's one of the men. This was a big battle too in South Carolina, part of the Southern Front in the Revolutionary War, where the Major Ferguson of the British demanded all the Americans to disarm, and they basically said screw you, and they fought the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780. This is Ferguson. He was killed, and he's shown here falling off his horse. So the Americans said, no, we're not your slaves. We're not going to do what you say. Here's another one where George Washington rallies the troops. He was in the middle of a lot of stuff. And then this guy came along to be aide-de-camp to George Washington, future president. And he was a brilliant guy. Alexander Hamilton was a genius, and he was a brave guy, too. He fought at, for example, at the Battle of Yorktown, and he led a charge of men up against an a well-reinforced position. They call them redoubts, where they'll have dug trenches and they're firing from a defended position. A very dangerous thing to do, and his men won. But like characteristic of the Americans, when the British soldiers, many of them surrendered to Hamilton, he let them live. He didn't shoot them. He didn't torture them. The British behaved much, much better in the Revolutionary War than did the Americans. Yeah, they didn't always behave as good as they should, but they behaved much better than the British did. Once Hamilton had captured that redoubt. It's called Redoubt Number 10. Now George Washington could move his cannons closer around the town of Yorktown, where they had the British surrounded, because unlike is now the opposite of what had happened in New York. Now the French came and controlled the waterways, and they've got the British trapped in a crossfire at Yorktown with General Cornwallis. And General Cornwallis was thus forced to surrender. And that was a big deal because he had a lot of troops. Cornwallis had to surrender 7,000 British soldiers. That's a lot of troops in those days. This is the painting by John Trumbull. In the center of the picture is actually, the American General Benjamin Lincoln, and right here the British General O'Hara. It's not Washington's off to the side over here. These are the French troops over here. Here's the American troops over here. So that was a big deal, winning the Battle of Yorktown. And that's what officially ended the war, with the Americans victorious. Here's Betsy Ross and the flag. And then, here's our Star-Spangled Banner song from 1814. Then conquer we must, for God is just, for our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God we trust. So again, that's an important thing, that the American founding fathers were Christians and placed their faith in God. And that's, again, the big reason why it was very different in America than it was in France. Okay, here's the First Amendment. And this is the Constitutional Convention where they made the Constitution. This was in 1787. It was presided over by George Washington. You can see Ben Franklin there. You can see Thomas Jefferson there. And this is a nice painting by Howard Chandler Christie in 1940. This painting's from. And so the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. First Amendment of the United States Constitution. That's very important. So when you hear people saying, oh, we have to prevent misinformation, bullshit. They're just trying to censor free speech. And when somebody says, oh, we can't allow hate speech, bullshit. People should be allowed to speak. You might disagree with them. You might not like that person, but they should be allowed to speak. Because what ends up happening is a tyrant will always declare anything that they don't want said as misinformation or hate speech. So, better to let people say a few things that are not nice than to not allow free speech. And then the Second Amendment, here's the quote from Noah Webster, another one of the founding fathers. He said, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom of Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be on any pretense raised in the United States. Yeah, and that's why the public should be able to bear arms so they can defend themselves, both from criminals and also from unfair treatment, okay? And that was an important point, and that's what it was all about at the founding and at the Constitution, and people should know that. Okay, when people say gun control, all they're talking about is disarming the law-abiding citizens, and the criminals will always have guns. So the citizens need to be armed so they can better protect themselves. That's pretty obvious. And the more armed the citizens are, the less likely that the government or criminals will abuse them. So, the question at the beginning of this lecture was, is George Washington the father of the United States of America? Yes, he is. And there should be a holiday named after him. There's a good reason to honor the founding fathers of a country, just like the Ten Commandments, honor thy father and mother. You should honor the father of your country. He was a very great man. He really was. Go ahead, study for yourself. Read a bunch of different sources, and you'll see what a great devoter this guy was. He left his farm to save his country, and he did it for no pay. He was not paid to be the leader of the United States Army against the British. He was not paid to be the president of the United States. Okay, and then his nickname was Cincinnatus, and Cincinnatus comes from the Roman man who was also, like George Washington, a farmer. And then when Rome was in trouble and at risk of collapse, they called him away from his farm, and he led the Romans to victory, and he did that twice. And as soon as Rome was safe again, he said, you know what, I want to go back to my farm. And he resigned all his power. Despite being the most powerful man in all of Rome, he resigned all his power, okay? And said, let me just go back to my farm. That's what I want to do. And George Washington did exactly the same thing. He didn't want to be king. He could have had himself declared king and set up a dictatorship. He was that powerful and that popular. But he said, no, I just want my country and my countrymen to be free. And he resigned his commission, and he went back to his farm. That's Cincinnatus. Again, they begged him to become president later on, so he said, okay, I'll be president. But so there's a great man, and we're very lucky to have our country founded by him. So anyways, I hope that was interesting.